Well, welcome everyone. As Erica said, we're going to open it up at the end for chats, for you to either chat or unmute yourself and ask a question. So keep that in mind as Sarah's giving her presentation. If you've been to our Tiny Talks in the past, we've there's been more of a moderator conversation, and we really want to encourage audience participation. So if you would like to jump on in the video and ask your question, that would be great. Cool. So we're here to hear Sarah Jacobs, and I'm just going to kind of read a brief bio, and then I'll hand it off to Sarah. So Sarah Jacobs is a contemporary artist whose work has been exhibited in the US and abroad. She has taken part in artist residencies in Germany, Colombia, and in New Mexico. She has had solo and two-person exhibitions in New York City, London, Poland, and England, among other cities. A large-scale reproduction of one of her paintings was displayed at the Pittsburgh International Airport from 2018 to 2019. Born in West Virginia and raised in Littlestown, Pennsylvania, Jacobs studied art history at Gettysburg College and received her MFA from the Hofberger School of Painting at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. She currently teaches at Carlow University here in Pittsburgh. And we have a beautiful series of prints of Sarah's paintings at Small Mall. They're available online, and we can link to the prints in the chat, so you can view those and purchase them. And I'll hand it off to Sarah, who's gonna start her presentation.
Great, thank you so much. I need to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen now? Nicole? Nicole, do you see my screen? I don't hear anybody, so.
I see it.
You see it? Okay, great, yeah. Cool. All right, good. Just double checking. All right, so first I want to say thank you so much to Casey for this opportunity to talk about my work. And I want to thank Erico and Nicole for the great introduction and for emceeing this. And I want to thank everybody who came tonight. I know it's a lot of my friends and my parents and my boyfriend, and so it's kind of an ideal audience for me. And I'm thrilled that some of you I don't know yet, and I'll get to learn about you in the Q&A, hopefully. And so in this lecture, I'm going to talk about my recent work and what I'm excited about now, but I'm also going to show you some of the work that I've made in the past that helped to lead up to this point. So looking back, I noted that some of the kind of work I did a long time ago kind of led me in this direction. And a lot of what I made over the years didn't lead me in this direction at all. And so it's gonna look like an easy progression when I go through this speech, but in fact, there were lots of things that I did that didn't really relate, but I'll show you here the ones that did. So I'm going to start by showing you, without any kind of commentary, just show you slowly a few of the recent pieces I've made so that you can get a sense of what I do now. And then we'll go back in time and move forward chronologically from there back into this period when I'll ultimately at the end talk about the more recent series. Oh, my clicker's not forwarding the, I can't forward my PowerPoint for some reason. That's so strange. Any thoughts, Nicole or Erica? It worked yesterday when we tested it. I'm going to stop the share and then share again and see if that works. Yeah, not able to forward. So let me try to share it differently. I might have to. Okay, now it works. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, I'm just going to show you a few of my recent works before I go back in time. All right, now we're going back in time to when I was a kid. As Nicole mentioned, I was born in West Virginia, but that's just because my dad was transferred there. I'm from Littlestown, Pennsylvania, and my parents are from there, and their parents are from there, and many generations back from this kind of region of the country. And South Central Pennsylvania is a Pennsylvania Dutch kind of area, and I'm Pennsylvania Dutch, which means that my family's been there a long time, and basically ancestors came from Germany ages ago. And the Pennsylvania Dutch are very kind of superstitious people, and so there's lots of good luck symbols in their artwork. And so on the far left, you can see a hex sign. Those are painted on barns, and the different symbols either mean good luck or warding off bad luck. In the middle, you see an example of fracture. I believe this is a wedding certificate, and there's significant symbols in fracture, and the birds in there are distal finks. And I'm pointing this out because the distal fink comes up again later in my lecture, so do please have a look at these and try to remember kind of what they look like. And they basically also mean, good luck. But when I was growing up, this kind of imagery was around. People's grandparents had this in their house, and so I grew up seeing a lot of symmetry and kind of hand-painted artwork like that. But also my grandfather was a wallpaper hanger, and on the right you can see a painting that I did of him in 2007. And back then, wallpaper was really in. I know it's not so much anymore, but in his kitchen, he had one wallpaper to a certain point, and then a banner of a different wallpaper, and then another wallpaper above it, as you can see in the back of this painting. And at the top, there's a whole other banner of wallpaper at the top. So I grew up with a lot of kind of patterns against patterns. And my mom frequently took me to wallpaper stores to kind of look through the books of wallpaper. So I grew up seeing lots of patterns. And also my mom is a painter, and people often say, well, you must have genes for it. You must have the painting genes, and that's not a thing, I don't believe. I mean, I'm a painting professor, a teacher, so I hope that that's not a thing, and I'm fairly certain it's not. I think that people who grow up with parents who paint or who make artwork or do any kind of artistic discipline simply see their parents doing the work and see the techniques that are being used and the parents' ideas of composition, and they just also realize that it's a thing to do, whereas people, if their parents aren't painters, they might not realize that they could be spending their time painting. And so I did learn a lot from her growing up. This is unfortunately a bit of a pixelated image, but here you can see that she did some representational imagery, and this is Paris, the Judgment of Paris. And she had 3 of my friends, a couple of whom I think are on this Zoom call right now, pose for this when we were in high school. And she also does abstract non-representational work. So here's an example of that, emphysema. And this is a recent piece of hers where she combines representational imagery with somewhat abstracted compositions. And so this is a piece that she finished recently that's really pretty big. And you can see some kind of similarities between her work and mine. And I think that we see each other's work and kind of get ideas from each other. I went to grad school. I went to my undergraduate school then and studied art history. And I loved medieval European artwork because of all the kind of blinginess and the gold, and the more is more aesthetic. Here you can see some medieval and Byzantine pieces that I particularly loved. And you can see the kind of influence on my work, the stuff everywhere. When I was in graduate school, I was painting people, and I was painting pretty loosely when I started, so I would have done these right before grad school. And in these 2 particular pieces, you can see that I'm starting to play with the picture plane. On the left, the man is pushing the wall with his knee, and it's bending the wall in, and the wall is the edge of the canvas. And on the right, I have a false frame painted on, and Chelsea's hand is kind of coming around it and breaking the picture plane, which is something that I try to do now. And then in grad school, I started making really weird things like this. I think I was watching too much Twin Peaks. But you can see I'm starting to get really detailed with things that are pattern-like the wood grain in trophies, and incorporating plants with repeating patterns in the Cabbage Patch Man. And on the left, you can even see a pattern that is foreshortened, which is something I later bring back quite a bit, and the pattern on the seat. And middle of grad school, I started to think of patterns as something that could go in the background of a subject matter. And so here you see plant shadows as motifs behind these pieces. For my graduate show, I began to incorporate patterns as signifiers of things. And so I was thinking of patterns here as kind of signifiers of the domestic, because we think of rugs and tapestries and these kinds of things as relating to patterns. And I believe this is how people in the pattern and decoration movement frequently would kind of relate to patterns as a signifier of the domestic. But if you look at the tiger's tail, for example, I began to make the background patterns line up with the foreground objects. His tail is hard to see, her tail is hard to see because of that, camouflaged a bit. And on the right, the wolf has a glaze of the pattern overlapping him. And here it is installed. And after graduate school, I got engaged and married to a British person. And before immigrating to the UK, I did a couple of residencies. So on the left is an image from Colombia in South America. And on the right, I spent 2 months in a really small village in Germany that was so small it had shepherds. And both was very influenced by people that I met. And one of the people that I met in Colombia said that I just rely too much on painting. And so I decided to spend a year just doing absolutely nothing to do with painting. And so in this year, I did some performance, I sculpted, I designed a billboard, I just did all kinds of things that I never would have done before just because I was so reliant on painting. And some of that did come up later and some of it didn't, but I'm so glad that I had that experience. It also helps as a teacher now. And then I finally got my visa and was able to move to the UK after a lot of stalling and having my visa rejected. And I lived first in London, and then I moved to Bristol for the second half of the time there, which is in the western part of England. And I lived there for a little over 3 years. When I was in graduate school, towards the end, I had a critic who asked me what I was planning to do next. And I said, I'm going to take the patterns in the backgrounds and I'm going to have multiple patterns come together and create amalgamated patterns and blend to make a kind of a dynamic backdrop for my subject matter. I was thinking maybe more animals or people. And she said, just get rid of the animals. You don't need them. And I thought that was just a crazy idea, painting without subject matter. And she said, yeah, you don't need subject matter. And so that's how I ended up painting abstracts for the first time. I never had done that before. And so at this time, I'm traveling around Europe quite a bit for exhibitions, and I am seeing lots of neat patterns, but I'm also realizing that in every place that I move, people think differently about the same things, and they kind of behave differently, different patterns of kind of going through your day. And so I started to think of patterns not as necessarily reflecting the domestic, but just reflecting this idea of like a pattern of behavior or a pattern of thinking. And so I began to bring patterns together in this series here. And so these hang like tapestries because a lot of the patterns that I'm bringing together patterns, I should say, from different time periods. You know, I'm an art history nerd, and different places, and trying to make them work together in a composition. So some of these reference the idea of tapestries, like having the band across the top, and it's unstretched so that it hangs like a tapestry, because a lot of patterns come from fabric. And these first two that I'm showing you, the compositions came from NASA imagery, which are all open source. And my ex-husband is an animator and illustrator. He had this Xander comic, and you can see very clearly here that his art was influencing my artwork. I just love this one particular panel from his from one of his comic pages, and it helped me to kind of design this piece on the right. And I was looking at other comic books because of him as well, and you can see I was looking at this particular one when I was designing this composition. And after 3 years of living in the UK, I became a naturalized citizen. This is my naturalization ceremony. And then I immediately moved back to the US without my husband, because it was the middle of the Euro crisis and I kept getting laid off from my jobs. And so I came back here mostly to find work because our country was starting to recover in a way that Europe wasn't quite yet at this point. And this was 2014, and before leaving, I was contacted by Bristol Cathedral, which is a big cathedral in the city where I lived, and they asked me to create a piece that would hang in there temporarily. And so while I was living in the US, I painted this, but then brought it back to the UK. And I had gone to the Bristol Museum and taken photographs of artwork within their collection that had patterns that I loved. And so all of the patterns in this piece are from the Bristol Museum, and the composition is inspired by a piece in their collection as well. And I tried to find an undulating style for this because it's Bristol is a port city, so there's a lot of water. And so I picked the colors kind of based on that as well. And so this series is very flat looking. I'm going to show you this compared to the series that comes after. So have a look at the next. My next series, even though it incorporates patterns, which normally flatten an image, I'm trying to incorporate an idea of volume and depth into them because I'm teaching 2D design at this point at the University of Maryland, and I'm teaching my students all kinds of tricks to create a sense of volume, and I thought maybe I could do that with patterns. And so the first trick I used was to incorporate a mirror because it just brings the whole room into the piece and it brings the viewer into the piece, so that automatically creates a sense of depth. And so the shiny parts here are the mirror. It was hard to photograph because, if it were shot from the front, you would see the photographer in it. So I cut out the parts that I wanted the mirror to be, and I built a frame with a mirror in it and attached this watercolor paper. And next I included highlights and shadows with the patterns to make them look embossed. And I made these patterns up. These are not from some kind of art historical source. They're just really basic shapes. Because at this point, I'm starting to think there's something funny about my relationship with the patterns that I'm using, and I couldn't put my finger on it exactly because I wasn't claiming to have designed them, and I was very explicit about how they came from, art historical sources. But I thought something seemed wrong, and so I was starting to more often than not just design my own kind of geometric patterns at this point. But with this piece, though, the 2D design trick, and I'll get more back to that in a moment, but the 2D design trick in here is that I have a gradient, which is a transition from kind of dark to light, and that can be smooth or choppy. And here you can see a smooth gradient. If you look in the yellow part particularly, you can see that it's darker at the edges and lighter at the middle. So the foreground is the flat, which is linear part, and the background has more of the depth in it, which is not what you'd normally see. And here is a more kind of elegant version of that where I created rules. So one of the rules was that for the yellow portion, anywhere that it touched something below it, it would be at its darkest point, and anywhere it hit something above it, it would be at its lightest point. And within the gray section, it's always darker at the edges. And for this piece, I also incorporated drop shadows. And I think they're really a little bit trippy looking because if the background undulates the way that it looks like it should, then the drop shadows shouldn't be even, but they are even across. And so it's totally impossible. I mean, it's an abstract, it's totally impossible anyway, but it's, I think that's one of the things I like about this piece. And in this piece, the same pattern exists 3 times, the pink one, and in its furthest away overlapped section, it's the lightest and smallest, and in its most close section, it's the biggest and darker, because that's the way that we actually see things that are further away are smaller and appear later because of atmosphere, water in the atmosphere. So I wanted to try the exact opposite, so I picked a really obvious motif to make it clear to the viewer what I was doing here. So in this, the further away sections are the largest, and the nearer sections become smaller as they get closer to us, which is the opposite of the way we would actually see in real life. That piece was fun in that way. And here I incorporated geometric patterns with geometric shapes that have diagonals, because diagonals we automatically read as looking 3D, even if they don't follow the rules of linear perspective, which they can't hear, because if they did, they would kind of diverge at a certain point and would no longer be a repeatable pattern. And so I think the easiest to see would be the one of the cubes. You see the black and lilac and gray pattern. It's called a metric projection, and it's this particular having two parallel sets of diagonal lines. And you see this in SimCity, which is, you know, the old SimCity, which is why I named this piece that. And then finally, I just threw everything together. You've got the drop shadows, the gradients, the highlights and shadows. You've just everything I did in the other paintings, I threw into this one. And so at this point, I am out of my tricks. You know, I have nothing left in my bag of tricks in terms of making something look 3D based on 2D design techniques. And so I wanted to incorporate actual representational imagery again, and certainly there is some representational imagery in the patterns. Like, for example, there are roses in the one pattern, but I'm talking about something that looks more realistic and has highlights and shadows and a whole fleshy body. And so I moved on to this next series that includes what looks like animal bodies. But before I talk about that, I want to start by talking about this idea of patterns and my relationship to patterns. So I was in line at Starbucks a couple of years ago, and I turned and I saw this mug, and I thought, what the hell, you know? And then I thought, what was up with your reaction to that? That's strange. I should be happy that, you know, Fractor is being highlighted in this way that's kind of shows it to a greater population, because Fractor is something that people who are Pennsylvania Dutch don't even really know about. And I don't actually particularly like Fractor. I'm not a superstitious person, and so I don't particularly relate to Pennsylvania Dutch things, but I know what they are. And this didn't seem exactly to hit the nail on the head with what Fractor is. And then I considered the fact that I love this character on The Office. He's Dwight Schrute, and he is Pennsylvania Dutch. And on the show, they make fun of the Pennsylvania Dutch, kind of using him for all these gags. And I think it's a riot. But I think the reason that I like him and the way that they're making fun of Pennsylvania Dutch on that show is because they understand what the Pennsylvania Dutch are. They've kind of gotten to know them enough to understand how to make fun of them in a really devastating way. Whereas with the Starbucks mug, it's really generalizing, and it's a vector image and it's perfect. Whereas actual Fractor was created by hand, and is part of the appeal of it is that it is so imperfect and kind of wonky, and it's a folk art. And so then I realized that it's this generalization that made the mug kind of annoying to me, and I'd rather something be made fun of for what it is than kind of celebrated for what it's not. And that's what I was doing in my paintings kind of up until this point, when I was using art historical paintings, because I wasn't taking the context of the paintings into consideration. And it's not like, I mean, maybe the person who designed the pattern had been dead for 1,000 years, but even if so, it had a context and it had its own sort of identity, and I was generalizing it aesthetically to fit into my own paintings, making all the patterns the same. And that was really not considerate of me. And it's not just a problem in terms of kind of concept or aesthetics, it's also a problem in terms of the way that the viewer would read the artwork, because if a viewer knew anything about the pattern, they would assume that I was using that pattern or incorporating that pattern for a particular reason, when in fact I was just putting different patterns together because they look cool. And so it just wasn't bright of me to do that. And so I decided at this point, I'm going to be more thoughtful about the patterns that I use, and there'll be a reason for the patterns that I choose. Okay, so this is the piece that I made first in this fleshy body series, and I can talk about why I chose those patterns in a moment to incorporate into this, but it'll make more sense after I tell you what an odalisque is. And so an odalisque, and this is the title of the painting, Odalisque. An odalisque was a subject matter that was painted frequently by people in the Baroque period on in Europe. So this is like a European man's idea of what a harem would be like. So it's sort of a fantasy situation. And you can see that these are, like, obviously, I don't think I have to explain why these are sexist and Orientalist and racist, but there is something that I like about these, in that they're really lusciously painted and blingy. they're almost always very beautifully and lusciously painted. And so when I see these, I'm kind of repulsed, but also just love all the fabrics, and I love all the bling in the same way I love those in the medieval paintings. And so I wanted to make a piece that would respond to this and be somewhat kind of sensual, but also kind of disgusting at the same time. And so that's why the courtesan, or the sort of slave girl, whatever you want to call her, she's replaced by this snake body, and it's not a whole snake. There's no head. It's just kind of lumpy, fleshy parts of a snake. And I chose these patterns because they look Middle Eastern, but they're not. These were designed in Italy by medieval Italians, and there was a lot of trade in Venice between the Middle East and Europe through Venice, and so people there would have seen these. And so these aren't actually Middle Eastern patterns, but they are made to look that way by Italians. And so I thought that these would be really appropriate to use in the idea of an odalisque, since odalisques were actually just fantasies in the minds of kind of European men. And at this point, I moved to New York, and I lived in really far north in Manhattan, where it's sort of affordable to live. And I worked in Midtown as an office manager at a marketing firm. And so I had taken some time away from painting so that I could be in New York. From teaching so that I could be in New York. And I started by making this piece that is, it has 11 caterpillars hidden throughout it. And the piece is, you see a caterpillar, you think of this idea of changing and growing. And so it's a biographical piece, because the patterns that are within it are all patterns that are found at my parents' house, or that were at my own apartment currently. And so these, almost like a self-portrait in a way, kind of growing up and moving on. That's why it's called Waiting to Be Born Again. And then Trump was elected, and everything felt kind of apocryphal and upsetting to me. And so I made this piece that looks very, it just looks like a lot, right? And it's dark and it's heavy. For this piece, I incorporated imagery that is really prominent in the Western canon. And so you have a rose window in the middle. The Book of Kells, of the Cairo page of the Book of Kells, is a big theme in Western art history. And with this, I tried to be more thoughtful about its aesthetic. And so you can see in the lower part, the foreground, the Book of Kells is the yellow section. And there you can see I painted the way that the paint was chipping. So I didn't just generalize the pattern, I painted it the way that it looks as it's crumbling now. And it also includes a William Morris pattern, big British designer. And the green vertical kind of diagonal sections that look embossed are from the interior of the Empire State Building. Inside the Empire State Building is an embossed image of the Empire State Building with lights coming, like shining beams of light coming out of it. And that's what I'm referencing there. And, parts of birds. So I only got 2 paintings done that year because I was commuting so far and working in Midtown. And I loved living in New York because I just could see so much artwork, but I wasn't getting enough done. And so I was really pleased to get offered a full-time teaching position in Pittsburgh, and that's when I moved here. I lived first in Squirrel Hill, and now I live in North Oakland. And here I switched from animal bodies to plants because I think plants have their own clear repetitions within themselves, and they also kind of overlap each other in a way that creates interesting depth. So I can do a lot of fun things with that. And I called this series The Cave because I was thinking about this idea of Plato's allegory of the cave. What is just a shadow, what is real? And within these paintings, there's something less realistic, something more realistic, but even the more realistic sections, of course, are just paint. They're totally flat, so they're not real. So in this, it's not really a pattern that the foliage is against. It's kind of a shadow of the foliage itself. So it's what the rest of the painting would have looked like if it were just a contrast of 2 colors. And my boss here constantly wore Hawaiian shirts, like with these kinds of patterns on them. And so I was seeing Dale quite a bit, and I wanted to make a piece that talked about him. And so you can see the fern coming in on the right side is somewhat camouflaged because, sorry, the left side is somewhat camouflaged because the colors are similar to what's happening in the patterns. And this piece is vertical, but I was contacted by Pittsburgh International Airport, and they asked if they could show one of my pieces, and I wanted to show this one because I like the way that it pops out. And they said, oh, it has to be a horizontal. Would you mind if we installed it horizontally? And normally I just thought that was such an odd idea, but I flipped it on my phone, the orientation, and I saw that it also looked good horizontally. And so I said, sure, you know, and I was just so pleased to be exhibiting there. In my classes, when we do abstracts, I have the students turn the canvas 4 times because sometimes they're surprised that it looks sometimes better in a different orientation. Someone gave me an adult coloring book, which is a little insulting to someone if they're a painter. So I created my own adult coloring book as a sort of response. Here the patterns come from a friend's mom grew up on a farm, and she gave me a couple of seed cloths that had cool patterns on them from the 1960s. She said, you got to paint these, they're so cool. And I also incorporated a Tommy Bahama pattern into this because I had worked for a marketing company in Midtown that marketed Tommy Bahama, so I saw enough freaking Tommy Bahama prints for the rest of my life. And the patterns are from the plants are actually from my mom's garden. Mom and dad are big gardeners. The pattern that is painted here is William Morris, and it's the second time William Morris has come up. I love his work. I saw this at the Met, this pattern, and I thought I could totally hide cornflowers in that in terms of the color that it was and the shapes that are within it. And so this gave me a chance to hide cornflowers in a William Morris pattern. And the surface is actually a found material that I actually got at Casey Drogy's moving sale a few years ago. So I just primed the parts of the canvas that I wanted to paint on so that the rest could be the surface itself pattern showing through. I'm not going to talk about every one of these because I need to have time for Q&A. This one, I wanted to incorporate all the kind of tacky motifs that you see in pot art, like the way that it's all tends to be floating in the middle of the composition and the sparkling stars all around, but also paint it in a very slow, loving manner. Usually it's a little bit more illustrative. And you're noticing a bunch of paintings with lots of foliage, and that'll come up again in a minute. But here's the first time I start creating my own patterns. So at this point, I just, I'm not finding what I want in patterns that exist in the world. I have an idea of what I want things to look like. And so I'm a control freak, and now I have total control designing my own patterns. From here on, I design all the patterns in my work. So now we're at last year, 2019, last summer. I spent it in New Mexico, and there I had 3 months, and so I got a lot of big paintings done. And I had been painting small. Previously I painted big until I got into this cave series. And this was all small because I'm using a really slow method that I call the glazing method that has lots of layers of translucent paint. So you have to paint the same thing about 5 times to finish it. And so I thought of a way to go big again, but still have realistic foliage or realistic elements within the larger piece. So on the left, you can see 3 paintings of basically the same kind of thing. So I isolated those in Photoshop, and I had paid someone to help me because I wasn't great at Photoshop yet. I'm okay now. I'm not that great, but I isolated just the realistic foliage parts, and then I turned them into a repeating pattern that was digital. And then my good friend and printer, Fran Flaherty, printed the repeating pattern on canvas for me, and then I painted on top of that. And so when this was first printed, it was just a wall of foliage, basically. So I edged around it with paint and painted the pink parts. So I designed these patterns, and the more kind of illustrative looking one came from 4 or 5 friends whose children sent me imagery of their drawings of plants. And so I traced those and turned them into a repeating pattern. So on the right, you can see that. You can see one kid wrote pine cone, but spelled it pin cone and has a little arrow. And I incorporated that actually into the pattern and into the painting too. And it's called Autumn because my goddaughter, Autumn Hargett, was one of the kids who sent me leaves and asked to be incorporated into this. Here's another piece where I incorporated the printed imagery. And on this, I designed a pattern of poppies. There was a big garden full of poppies down the street from where I was living in New Mexico, and poppies represent death. And so I juxtaposed those with a sapling, which of course gives you the sense of kind of new life. And I was thinking about rebirth in this piece. And this is actually behind me. I'm not sure if you can see my face right now, but this painting is hanging behind me right now in my apartment. And touchy-feely is a diptych. That's why it has a line between them, the two panels. And when I was in New Mexico, there's a plant there called salsify that is very much like a dandelion, and its seeds floated through the air all summer and made me gag a lot because I have terrible allergies. And so I wanted to incorporate them in this piece. And Taos, New Mexico also has amazing sunsets. And so that's, those are the two of the main kind of reasons that I kind of made this piece. But I was also playing here with a really flatly rendered imagery versus more voluminous imagery. So that's easiest to see on the right panel bottom. There's a really flatly painted cactus with a black succulent coming around in front of it for comparison. And now we're up to this year. I will talk about what I'm doing now. It's the body of all of them together. The first thing I did when I got back from New Mexico, well, a little bit later, was to create this piece in collaboration with Prahlad Menon, who's a data analyst. He created an algorithm that will search the internet based on a keyword that you feed it and learn what people think the word means visually. And I had said to him that his compositions were all too centered, the things that it was creating. So he tweaked his algorithm so that I could input a composition that's just grayscale into it and then feed it a word. And so here's the composition that I designed, plus the word sunrise. So the algorithm came up with the gradients and the colors in the background, and I designed the patterns, and they all relate to my time in New Mexico, the plants there, or kind of patterns that I saw at the Helene Wurlitzer Foundation. And of course, I painted the flowers too. And when I was there, in New Mexico, I purchased this fabric, which was designed by a couple who lived in Taos, who had connections in Peru, who kind of created, so they always designed these patterns, and then their friends in Peru would create them for them and ship them back, and then they'd sell them. And so I loved this color, and I just loved it. And so I printed, I didn't print it. I just stretched the canvas itself because it was strong like canvas, and I painted on top of it. And I made this piece three-dimensional. You can see on the right, this was before I added the blue to the painting, but you can see that I use molding paste and it comes off the surface. This was created once we were all in lockdown, and it's the first thing I made that was ever potted, and it has butterflies in a box, dead, trapped. And the pattern isn't repeating in any sort of logical way. Things are just floating, the rectangles are just floating everywhere. And I thought of these rectangles as representing screens, like we're seeing each other right now through screens. But I think the most important thing about this is that they just are wherever they are. There's no kind of logic to it. I think that's how we all felt for a while. And this is my most recent piece, which is a self-portrait. I'm finally back to doing people again. And I called it Oh, I Feel Ya, because it is based on Ophelia by John Everett Millay, I think that's how you say it. So this is in Tate Britain, and I was able to see this in person when I lived there, and I was always struck by it. And so just to remind you, Ophelia was the girlfriend of Hamlet, and Hamlet and her brother and her dad all drove her nuts, and she kind of went crazy and drowned in the river. And so I wanted to make a piece that responded to that by having a woman who's kind of happy and like confidently coming out of the water. But now when I'm looking at these side by side, I think that the one on the left kind of reminds me of when we were all first on lockdown, and Not sure what to do. And we all felt a little bit crazy or a little bit overwhelmed. And then the one on the right is kind of what I imagine people will feel like once there's a vaccine and we can all go out. Everybody's just gonna party so hard. So I think the biggest difference would be in the rendering of of course, the expressions, but also the rendering of the faces. His is sfumato, which means smoke. It's got a dark, smoky, but lovely transition between the highlights and the shadows, whereas mine is really stark and bright, like I'm emerging into a spotlight. And the way a person would know that this is related to this, I believe, is that I designed the pattern based on the flowers in Ophelia. So when I have traditionally designed patterns for the last couple of years, I have done it on paper, photographed it, put that photograph into Photoshop, and then turned it into a repeat. But then I would project that on the canvas, trace it, and paint it. And I realized recently that I could actually do all the painting from the beginning instead of painting every single one of them. So here I isolated the orchid from the screens painting, and I painted on watercolor some roses and I think it's a chrysanthemum. I can never say the name of this flower. Chrysanthemum, I think. And I created these 3 flowers because I'm going to do something with this pattern, which was printed on cotton by Fran Flaherty again. I'm going to incorporate it into my next painting, which will be another human being. It'll be my boyfriend, Sean. And I'm not going to tell you exactly how I'm going to incorporate this printed cotton into the painting, but you'll see when it comes out. And I designed this particular pattern because the flowers in this kind of relate to things that have to do with him. Oh, and I forgot that was the last one. But I also wanted to mention that I'm considering designing more patterns for my paintings, but also maybe to sell as a side business to sell patterns. And so if anyone has any advice for me in that, I'd appreciate that as well. And thank you so much for listening to me talk about myself for half an hour. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Yay! Thank you, Sarah. That was amazing.
Thank you.
So I'm going to allow everyone to unmute themselves, which you'll have to do if you'd like to jump in and ask a question. So if anyone wants to jump right in, go for it.
So my mom and dad are here. Hi. My boyfriend's here. I can see Kathleen and Mark on the screen. I'm going to go to gallery view so I can see more of you guys. Stephanie, hi. Hey, Emma and Chris. Clara, hello. I can't see everybody. Oh, hi, Ned.
Oh,
Katie.
Yeah, you can switch to, everyone can switch to gallery view so it's like community. You can see everyone's faces.
Hi, Joanne. My mom and dad can meet my boyfriend's sister now. This is interesting. This is cool. So does anyone have any questions or comments?
All right, I'll jump in. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
As it's Chris, Chris Kelly. So you had alluded to it, seeing the kind of arc of what you're doing and how what you've done for years has gotten you where you are. If there's any like tangents you've taken, because we've obviously seen a bunch of art over the years and have some. I think we have a print above us. But like what when you're doing it, and especially when you were younger, like you took tangents. What did you learn from the things that you decided? Well, that's not really my style.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I could have shown you so many things that I did. I probably did more things that didn't relate to what I do now than things that I have. And so, I mean, some of the things I've done have incorporated like cow eyes, like actual cow eyes, and like you have an image of the billboard I designed. And so, I mean, these things are worthwhile as kind of one-offs, I think. Not everything has to ultimately become the thing that you do. But also, I've noticed that some of the things that I did in the past that I thought were one-offs, like a sculptural piece that I made, actually ends up coming back later. And so, that I showed you the piece with the succulent that was 3-dimensional. If I hadn't ever learned to sculpt, it never would have come back. And I didn't anticipate that I would sculpt again, but luckily it ended up being helpful. And so I think it's important to, go off and kind of people used to say, let your freak flag fly, you know, just do whatever you want, and sometimes not necessarily have a purpose, and maybe it'll come back. And if not, it doesn't matter. It's still good to have done it. Thanks, Chris. So my mom is the one that says Robin's iPad. She's the painter I showed earlier.
Hey. Hey, I have a question.
Sure.
Well, not really a question. When you were first starting and kind of getting to be well known, you used to kind of pick on me because the stuff I do, none of it, like you could put none of it in a collection like your collections. Like you make collections.
Yeah.
To kind of explore things. Like why is that important?
I mean, it helps when you have an exhibition, you know, helps the people know how to market it. But you do have series. I mean, you don't think of it that way because you make an abstract and then you make a representational piece and then you do a landscape. But now if you look back at everything, you've got a whole bunch of landscapes, a whole bunch of abstracts, and a whole bunch of, you know, the combo things that you're making now. And so I think you do work in series. You just work on multiple series at once.
Yeah, kind of like,
Yeah.
I don't actually have a plan like you do.
Well, I don't always have a plan. It looks like it in the speech because I only show the things that relate to the next thing. But like Chris was saying, he's got some stuff, like he and Emma have some things of mine that are kind of way out there.
Well, you did a good job making it look like you always have a plan.
Yeah, thanks. I'm good at bullshitting, yeah.
Well, if I can make a comment, I do think that people, even if they feel like they don't have a plan, their body kind of tends to do something and their mind tends to kind of gravitate towards a certain direction. So I think eventually you will see like thematic things that come out in the work, you know, and it's just kind of being conscious, you might be able to help direct it. But I think, and I can tell, you know, why do you recognize like a singer's voice or a musical style without even ever having heard the song before, or someone's artwork, you know? Like I can look at a painting and I can sense sometimes whose work it is just from their style or their color choices. So
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of the times we'll make something and it doesn't seem at the time like it's going to come back, and then it does later. So I was looking through a lot of old work when I was creating this presentation, and I never thought some of that stuff I did in grad school had anything to do with what I'm doing now, but looking back I can see it.
I think things cycle. I think but each generation has a slight variation of the theme. You know, it's either going to be very complex or very simple or representational or abstract. You know, and then people play games. You know, Chuck Close playing games with his super realism, but yet when you look closely, it's totally abstract. Each like little square or something. Yeah. Which is fun. Which is it seems like that's what you're doing. You're playing this game of like, you know, working from a traditional inspiration into your version of reality, which is very complex.
Thanks, Ned. And Ned's a great musician. Yeah. Hi, Doug and Chelsea, just singing now. And Sheila.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
I have a comment and then I guess a question. This is the first time I've been a part of this, whatever we're doing here. Usually I would go to the 6x8s, but and this is the first time I'm seeing your artwork, and I'm just blown away.
Thank you.
I think that your thought process is crazy insane, but in a good way. Like, you're so thought out with the patterns that, and it's repetitive throughout. It's, you know, a thread that goes and goes and goes. And I'm really impressed, and I think it's I just think it's amazing. I've loved everything that I've seen, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit further about, is it obelisk?
Odalisque,
and when you were saying, you know, those older paintings, and I was reading recently about like the male gaze, And did you incorporate that in how you pictured, using the snake pattern? Because I just think that's just so cool.
Yeah, I thought a snake was the perfect thing for that because they're beautiful and have patterns on them. So there's patterns that are overall, the diamond kind of patterns, but the scales themselves are patterns. But it's also something that you could look at and say, God, that's so gorgeous. Or you could say, that's disgusting. And so it was the perfect kind of object to put in there.
Yeah, I love juxtaposition. Like, it's grotesque and beautiful all at once.
Thank you.
I just think to be able to capture that, I think that's pretty incredible.
Thanks.
Hey,
Hey,
I have a question about your symbols. So earlier you were talking about being Pennsylvania Dutch and looking at the factors and stuff. And one of the things is you don't identify as much with being Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yeah, no.
You're not superstitious. You're like, what is this about? Whatever. I noticed with a lot of your in your patterns in your artwork, like you were saying, like, okay, I'm just using these whatever symbols just because they look cool, and then you're having more intentionality, but it's symbols from nature. It's not necessarily other symbols like that have any sort of meaning. Do you foresee kind of your artwork branching out into more symbols that might have like a metatextual analysis to it, like where it's referencing something else, kind of like factors?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the self-portrait, Oh, I Feel Ya, it references that that other painting. Yeah. And the one that I'm creating for Sean, who's here, he's wearing the headphones, he's my boyfriend. One that I designed for him that you saw in that last picture where I had the cotton wrapped around me. That one, flowers have certain meanings. You look it up on the internet or these flower books. And so I tried to go through and find flowers that would have meanings that related to Sean, his personality, but also I chose white ones because he looks great in white, and I have it on a kind of a baby blue background because he looks great in baby blue, and I know it's going to come out well in the painting. So, but kind of partly thoughtful and partly because it'll look good.
Very cool. Yeah, not that you weren't thoughtful in what you were thinking of before and what you were doing with your patterns, but it's just kind of an interesting progression where you're like, okay, these look really cool, and I'm doing all these really cool things with these symbols and patterns to like making it kind of mean something, kind of like in like the fractal sense.
Now, sometimes for instance, the one that had the pattern of the kind of strawberries that grow in somebody's yard, not the strawberries that you'd eat. For that one, I just really wanted, I'm just thinking, I gotta have the strawberries, and I have no idea why. So sometimes not everything has a meaning that I do. A lot of it just doesn't, but having this art historical background, I could see me hopefully doing that sometimes, yeah.
Cool.
It's hard for the viewer because then you don't know if it's meaningful or not.
Yeah.
All right, can I ask something to follow up about that?
Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Really, really nice talk. So I was just kind of wondering now with the realization that you were using patterns solely for their aesthetics and not paying attention to any of the context, is there any like less pride in that in your early artwork? Like, do you?
Yeah, definitely. I'm kind of embarrassed by it. Certainly, yeah. It's kind of because it's the kind of thing that now looking back, like I should have figured that out really easily. And then I had to see that Starbucks thing, and it's sort of like, oh, wait a minute, I have an aesthetic tradition, like the way the guys say, oh, wait a minute, I have a daughter. I'm not going to be sexist anymore. So yeah, it's pretty embarrassing. Yeah.
A little bit extreme, but yeah, I get it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, not to the same degree, but yeah.
Hey Sarah, I have a question. You've been an art teacher for a little while now, an art professor for a little while. Do you think working with students has impacted your art at all?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think particularly the lessons that I teach, because when you're teaching a medium, an introductory class, you have to go back to basics and relearn everything. I had painted in an alla prima manner for a long time, and then when I went to complete my curriculum for my painting class, I realized that I had to not just teach what I do, but teach kind of the glazing method. I have to teach impasto. I have to teach like alternative methods like stenciling and stuff like that that I don't normally do. And so I relearned them. And that was helpful because then I realized that I could be incorporating them into my own work and I might not have otherwise. And when I taught 2D design, my very first class teaching as an adjunct, I had never had a 2D design class because my first year I transferred away from the school where I was because the professors often weren't showing up. And so in my 2D design class, the professor didn't come a lot of the times and we didn't actually learn any 2D design. So I had to teach myself 2D design in the 2 weeks between when I was hired to teach the class and when I taught the class. And so it was a heck of a busy time. But what was really interesting though is I had grown up painting with Mom and she knew what made a good composition. And so I heard her talking about compositions and she didn't have, I mean, she wasn't talking in the kind of terminology that we use in 2D design class, but I just learned what was a good composition intuitively. And then when I taught the class, I was able to explain it better and it came more, it infiltrated my artwork in a stronger way, whereas before I was just relying on my intuition. And also these kind of tricks that I was talking about in terms of creating volume and shadow, I mean, that, you know, really was inspired by the projects that I was having the students do in that course. So yeah, definitely. And also just, you know, in courses when, you know, Katie actually was one of my students, she's here. In the upper level courses, we do critiques with the students, but I'll occasionally show them what I'm working on too. And so it's nice because they can critique me and I get, you know, ideas from them as well. So that's pretty neat.
Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Mark.
Hey. That was a really fun talk.
Thanks.
Do you have any interest in more computer science collaborations or artificial intelligence,
maybe.
that kind of thing?
Yeah, Mark, you know, works with computers and biology combined. Yeah, I would be interested maybe. I mean, it depends on the project, but, you know, talk to me.
Cool.
Cool. Well, was there anything in the chat box or? So I'm just so pleased that you guys all came, and it's just so nice to see people from different parts of my life all together here. So I appreciate you taking the time listening to me.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for coming. To close it out, Sarah, can you tell us what you're currently working on, or if you're showing any work anywhere, or any other shows? And how
I'm currently working on painting of Sean, but I don't want to talk about too much because it's a new way of working. But I have a show coming down this week at the Chautauqua Institution in upstate New York, and I have work coming back at the end of this month from an exhibition that's on right now at the Anne Marie Sculpture Garden, which is part of the Smithsonian in Maryland. And I have a solo show in New York at Atlantic Gallery, and it's only a 1-week show, but it was supposed to be this summer, and because of COVID, it's not happening, and so it's postponed for a to be decided date. So I can't say when it's going to happen yet, but I'm excited about that one.
Awesome.
Thanks for asking.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you everyone for coming and listening to Sarah's talk. And yeah, that's it.
Great. All right. Yeah. Thanks very much, everybody.